We are Laura and Bryan Smith, and we are so excited to be here. We've been Preston Trailers for about 5 years, and in fact, this is my cute little family. Max is 2. Some of you know him because you're in my hallway, so I know you. And then Jack is 6. He's in kindergarten this year, which is, that's a fun age. Just saying. Okay, so we want to give you a little background about why this topic is important to us. Why are we here? So firstly, we both grew up in Christian households, which we're very, very grateful for that foundation. But we realized as we were kind of getting older that the foundation that we had and what we were learning in science class and then what we were learning at church didn't always come together. We actually met at high school church camp. Kind of like this. 20 years later, just FYI, be careful who you intermingle with, because 20 years later, I'm just saying. Okay, we both went to A&M. Whoop! Any future Aggies, please? Yes, okay, excellent. Well, I'm sorry if you're not. It's fine. It's fine. So I went to college, fell in love with science. I ended up getting a degree in education, and I taught middle school science for about 10 years. But it was because of Bryan's influence, and I was really growing in my love for science even after college, that I ended up starting a master's program in science and faith. The last 4 years of my teaching experience, I got to teach at a private school. And so I got to actually teach science from a Christian perspective, and which I hadn't had for several years. And it was exciting for me when I saw students, a lot like yourselves, realize that you can love God and you can use your brain. You do not have to check your brain at the door, which for most of culture tells you that you do. So.
Awesome. Well, as you can imagine, I'm Bryan. I'm also super excited to be here. I've had an interest in science and faith for as long as I can remember. Growing up when I was about y'all's age in high school, math and science, that was my favorite subjects, especially physics and math. So really loved science and math, went into college, continued studying science and math, got a bachelor's of science in mechanical engineering, and have continued to love keeping up with the science progress even today. On the faith side, as Laura mentioned, I also grew up in a Christian home. So faith has always been a big part of my life as well. During my time in college, however, I did kind of begin to question a lot of elements of my own faith and went on a kind of a personal journey looking for answers. I didn't really know what to expect or what I would find, but I was very surprised to find that there are lots of great answers out there for the questions that I had. And that was very exciting to me. It also instilled within me a passion for sharing those answers with others who may be questioning the same things that I was. In fact, that passion continued to grow after I graduated college, went out into the working world, so much so that a few years after that, I went back to college for a second time, went to graduate school and studied philosophy, specifically philosophy of religion and philosophy of science. Ended up graduating with a master's in philosophy, and throughout that whole time period as well, just learned a whole lot and really just solidified the conviction that I had come to develop that the Christian faith is not a blind faith, but it is in fact a reasonable faith, that there are good reasons for why we believe what we do as Christians. As well as, I think my mic just went out, but the importance of loving God with all of our minds, to see all truth as God's truth, whether it comes from the Bible or science, theology, philosophy, etc. And science in particular has a lot of exciting truths that relate to our faith, which is what we're excited to share with you today.
We're going to cover a lot of information. This is not, you might feel like you're in a church building, but this is going to be a lot of science. But we don't want you to get caught up in the weeds of it all. We're going to give you some resources at the end that if you're interested in some of this, we want to have a place for you to go and get some more answers. And at the very end, we'll kind of recap some of the stuff that we talked about. We also want you to know we are not experts in this field. I am not a cosmologist, nor am I a physicist. I am a mom of 2 little kids. That's number one for me. But truly, we are just 2 Christians who we love God, we love you, we love to learn, and so we're excited to share that with you. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so our question to start is this: can you believe in God and science at the same time? Many people in our culture today would say, nope. You might have heard of some of these people or might have seen some of these people before. Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins. These are 2 really big loud scientists, and they have a lot to say. And so you might have heard some of their influence. To them, religion gets in the way of science. They think more science leads to less God. And as a result, science and faith are not seen as friends, but instead they're seen as foes. And this has seeped so deep into our culture that this has almost become pure fact because someone said so. This quote says, faith and science are absolutely incompatible. They cannot exist together. Mankind must make its choice. It cannot have both. But are they really absolutely incompatible? Is there absolutely no way for them to be on the same playing field? And that's kind of what we want to talk about today. Our conclusion, that we hope yours will be by the end of this, is that they're not enemies, but in fact, they're actually friends. And that this idea really has been around for a long time. In fact, since the very beginnings of science. So where did this idea that they were in conflict actually come from? So that same quote I just read to you is this guy. His name's John Draper, and he wrote a book back a long time ago in the 19th century called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And that quote that I read was actually in there. And so under its influence, as well as some other books that were around at the same time, this idea of warfare started to come out, that science and faith were not able to be in the same playing field. And this view really actually became prominent even amongst Christians. But what happened in the second half of this last century is that historians and philosophers of science started to realize that this really is a myth. For over 300 years, between the 1500s and the 1800s, the rise of modern science really was an alliance. In fact, you probably have seen some of these their names in your science textbooks. People like Johannes Kepler, who developed the laws of planetary motion, or Robert Boyle, he's the father of modern chemistry. Of course, Isaac Newton, everybody's heard about him, right? These are some big major players, and none of them had any problem with their faith and science coming together. So this whole conflict was really a recent invention of the in the late 19th century, and it was encouraged by people who wanted to undermine that Christian thought. And so they came in with this understanding, this idea called naturalism or scientism. Naturalism is a view that nothing outside of nature is real. What we see is what we get. And scientism is a view that the only way to truly know truth is through science. But unfortunately, they were very successful in pushing this idea, because you've probably heard that before. But philosophers of science in the last 100 years have really come to see that this war is not only completely false, but that this sort of view is not a view of science. It's actually an approach to science, that these ideas are added on to scientific inquiry. Neither one of these are considered scientific, and they're both actually philosophical. And there are people that might agree, okay, well, they're not at odds, but they're also not really friends either. They don't get along at all. But they say that science and faith don't work together, and that they're two separate bodies of truth. So what you talk about on a Sunday, you can't talk about in the classroom at all. So this phrase is kind of a phrase that's kind of been very popular. Science rests on facts, faith rests on beliefs. But in our opinion, this is also false.
That's right. So when you look at the first point, you have to ask yourself, does science always rest on facts? Well, obviously, in a large number of cases, it does, but it doesn't always, and that's the key here. So when scientists go out, they observe the universe and explore the world, they'll often come across questions which are actually not scientific in nature, but rather philosophical. For example, how did all of this even get here in the first place? That's actually a philosophical question. So these types of questions that are not scientific can't be answered on the basis of the scientific method. However, they can be illuminated to some degree by a theological or philosophical perspective. As for the second point, that faith merely rests on beliefs and not facts, or that faith makes no factual claims about the world, this too is also false. If you look back throughout all of history, various faith traditions often would make factual claims about the nature of the world. For example, ancient Greeks would typically view the sky as resting on the shoulders of Atlas, as you see on the bottom left there, who is a Greek god. Other ancient Indian religions would typically view the world as resting on the back of a giant turtle, which is the other one, which both of those seem really silly to us today, but back in the day, those were serious beliefs. Those are serious factual claims that those traditions were making about the world. Moving more towards our current day and age, many Eastern religions, like many forms of Hinduism, would see the world as in some sense divine and therefore eternal, aka the universe has always been here. It didn't just begin to exist, it wasn't created. So we see, whether it's through history or even today, various faith traditions make these claims. Our faith tradition is no different. So Christianity, as well as Judaism and Islam, would claim that the universe is not divine or eternal, but was created by a divine being, and so began to exist at some point in the past. Now, all of those can't obviously be true, but the key point is that they are all making claims that can be either verified or falsified by science. And so what we put here on the screen is kind of what I think is the best approach, what we think is the best approach to viewing science and faith. And then it's sort of like a Venn diagram where we've got these two circles that overlap in the middle. You've got science or scientific evidence on the one hand, and faith, theological reflection on the other. Those can operate to some extent independently of one another, but there is a very central area in which they overlap. And it's in that area where the conversation between science and faith has taken place and continues to take place today. So we've got two big universities on the screen. I only wanted to bring this up to say that this conversation that we're talking about, it's not just in churches, it's not just among Christians or Christian schools. This is at the most prestigious, top-notch universities in the world. Cambridge and Oxford universities, in fact, have established entire departments in science and religion, which, given their stature in the academic world, has served to only further legitimate this type of dialogue today.
So here's why this matters. Some of us, we think sometimes these conversations only happen in a church, like you said. And we've heard some of the dissensions that are coming too. We hear these big people who make these big claims. But really, they're the ones that are swimming against the stream. They're not swimming with the course of academia. So we want to highlight today two different ways. And if you don't get anything else from today, these are kind of our two bases that we want you to get. That science and faith are overlapping, they're interactive, and they're compatible, and they support and enrich each other. So first is that faith underlies science, and second, that science underlies faith. And if you miss some of the details while we're talking about this stuff, like we said, we're going to give you some resources at the end that if you're interested in that particular topic, there are answers that you can find. But let's go ahead and kind of jump into these. So the first one is that faith underlies science. So what does that mean? First, it's important to understand that science is not something that scientists discovered. It's not like it was out there somewhere and we just happened upon it. Science is actually something that they invented to help them use and look at and learn about the world around them. So I'm going to use a plant analogy kind of for this. Like every other cultural institution that we have, science requires a unique soil in which to grow and flourish. And though we saw hints of science in the past, the Egyptian pyramids, for example, like we've seen how they had to have done something to be able to build those incredible pyramids. But truly, although we saw hints of it in the ancient world, systematic modern science as we know it today would not exist without European institutions. Science really began in the European sphere. And why is that important? Well, unlike those other civilizations like the Chinese or the Egyptians, any civilization before it, the European civilization really was rooted in a Christian worldview. And it was that unique contribution of the Christian faith to that culture that provided that soil in order for science to grow and flourish. And unlike some of those ones that he mentioned earlier, Buddhism and modern Hinduism, Christianity does not have the view that the world is all that there is or that it's somehow equal to God, but instead it sees the world as created by God. And so because of that, the world is open to exploration and to discovery. And for us, that's normal because that's what we do. We see the world and we want to go and explore it. But for most of human history, that wasn't the case. And for most worldviews, that's not the case. So without that Christian worldview that the European civilization gave us, modern science like we know it would not exist.
So to put it a little bit differently, there are many things that science assumes that it has to in order to even get off the ground, but which science itself cannot really prove or establish, but that can be guaranteed and are guaranteed by a Christian worldview. Now, I've listed a few on the screen here. Each one of these we could give a whole talk on. And these do tend to be a little more abstract, more philosophical in nature. So if you feel like your head's in the clouds or you feel like you get lost, don't worry, we can come back to these during the Q&A if we need to. But just to go through these quickly, so number one, logical and mathematical truths. Logic and math, as we all probably know, is fundamental to science. You can't do science without logic or math. Yet again, science can't prove either one of these. For those of you in here who have taken geometry, Maybe you've done geometrical proofs,
Ugh.
whether you liked them or not. You probably remember it.
Hated them.
If you do have the pleasure of doing that, you'll remember that when you're doing geometrical proofs, you're using geometry, math to prove math. And in fact, logic and math, by the very nature of those disciplines, can only be proven through logic and math. Number two, metaphysical truths. I know that's a big word. Metaphysical comes from the word metaphysics, which is just a fancy word for the study of ultimate reality, what ultimately exists in the world. Here, science actually makes a rather surprisingly large assumption, and that is that there actually is a world outside of ourselves. Now, you may be thinking, well, what are you talking about? Science can prove that there's a world. Not necessarily. Science operates within the realm of what we call our sense experience, to use a technical term. So when science goes out and they perform experiments, for example, they're going to be observing things using the 5 senses that we have, whatever we can see, taste, touch, smell, feel, or hear, whichever one I missed. All of those are evidence that's coming into our senses, but science can't show that what our senses are telling us actually correspond to something outside of our senses. And so metaphysical truths like that cannot be proven scientifically, but surely science makes all sorts of claims about the world. And so it has to assume this type of metaphysical truth to even get going. Lastly, ethical truths. Ethics typically we don't think relate much to science. And in many cases that they are independent, but there are several ethical truths that are infused throughout all of science. If anything, just to distinguish good science from bad science. So, for example, we all would recognize the value of being honest, right? We'd say it's morally good to be honest. It would be morally wrong to lie in most cases, right? Well, in a scientific approach to, let's say, performing an experiment, we would all say in that case it's wrong for a scientist to say, I don't know, fabricate evidence just to support a conclusion that they want to be true, even though the real evidence doesn't support it. That would be morally wrong. But science can't really prove that there's anything wrong with that. Again, these types of moral truths and moral obligations are outside of science. That science has to assume these, cannot prove these, and the list could go on and on. So all three of these, again, big assumptions that science makes, cannot be proven by science, but the big point we want you to come away with is that we do get these with the Christian worldview. So if you ask yourself, well, what reasons do we have to believe in any of these? Well, one big reason would be the truth of Christianity. So logic and math, we get those on a Christian worldview because those basically reflect nothing less than the mind of God. So when we think logically or do math, in an important sense, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. With respect to number two, metaphysical truths, we have good reason to believe that there is a world outside of our own experience because we believe that there is a God who has created that world, that we are not, as our parents may have told us sometimes, the centers of our own universes. You know, the world does not revolve around us. There is a world out there. And because we've been created in God's image, we have the type of minds that are capable of coming to know and understand the world that God has created. And then lastly, with respect to ethical truths, moral values, moral obligations, these are ultimately anchored or rooted in the very nature and character of God. So we get all of these and more.
Okay, so we've kind of done the first one, faith underlies science. The second one's got a little bit more sciencey things in it, if you get what I'm going. So what does this mean that science verifies faith? Science can and does provide evidence that support various claims that are made by the Christian faith. So today we're going to focus on kind of the main hard sciences that provide what we think is the best evidence. Physics, astrophysics, and biology have some really good stuff that are in them. So let's start with the beginnings of the universe. One of the most fascinating areas of science where science is verified by faith actually come from studying the universe itself. One of the most foundational claims, you've all read this verse, you all know this verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? We claim that the universe had a beginning and that God created it. This seems pretty insignificant to us. It's like the first verse. We get that easy. But before this 21st century, it's pretty important to understand that for most of human history, from ancient Greek philosophy all the way up to modern atheism of the 19th century, the universe was seen as endless and eternal and unchanging. So this is Bertrand Russell. He's a very well-known atheist philosopher. He says the universe is just there, and that's all. It seems really depressing if you ask me, but that is what he thought. And if you are going to be told true to some of those atheist beliefs, that's kind of the conclusion that you come to. But really in the last century, science has made some really remarkable discoveries. So let me start with the first one, the second law of thermodynamics. Is anybody in physics or been in physics yet? Anybody? Who's in physics? Raise your hand. Actually, I want to ask this really fast. What science are you in right now? Biology, physics, chemistry, earth, space. Oh, that's my favorite. Aquatic science? Fancy. I didn't have that when I was in high school. Okay, cool. I had 3 options. Awesome. Okay, well, if you are in physics, or if you learned a little bit of physics in 8th grade, 7th, 8th grade science as well, you might have heard of the second law of thermodynamics. Review for you if you don't know. The second law of thermodynamics says that the universe is slowly running out of energy, right? It's going, as it has energy, it eventually will run out. But here's kind of a theoretical understanding. If the universe had been here forever, then the universe would have run out of energy by now. So the fact that we are here and that the universe has not run out of energy, thank you very much, that means that the universe has to have had a beginning. And so this is really powerful in and of itself, but there's a whole lot more stuff that kind of has come along since then. This guy is probably quite familiar to you, Albert Einstein. In 1915, he presented his general theory of relativity. It's a theory of gravity that replaced Newton's theory of gravity. And this really gave scientists some really meaningful things to talk about with the history of the universe. And in fact, when Einstein was actually developing his theories, he actually messed with his own numbers, because when he was developing his theory, he realized this is proving that this had to have a beginning. It couldn't have just been here forever. So even he did what Bryan just talked about, that bad science idea. Einstein did a little bit of that. A few years later, scientists that were working with his equations actually predicted that the universe is actually expanding.
So in 1929, an astronomer by the name of Edwin Hubble, he's here on the screen. You may also recognize his name from the Hubble telescope, which was named after him. Anyways, he discovered what's called the redshift of light from distant galaxies. Now, again, this is another thing we can't get into the details right now. If you've got questions after, we can handle those. But long story short, this observational evidence, so we talked about Einstein, that's theoretical. This is observational evidence. Confirms what the scientific theories were saying at the time, both that the universe is expanding, space itself is expanding, and therefore because of that, that if you go back in time, it contracts down to what's called a singularity, aka the universe had a beginning. And this was a very unexpected discovery, very surprising. It really shook the foundations of modern science in many ways. As Robert Jastrow, who was the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, once put it, he said, "The scientist has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." This one always gives me a kick, because you got this idea here that science has finally caught up to where faith has been for thousands of years. In any case, this evidence that we've just gone over doesn't merely confirm or verify one of the central claims of the Christian faith, which is the universe began to exist. It also gives us very powerful reasons to believe in the existence of God, known as the cosmological argument. This kind of reasoning can be summarized as follows. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Therefore, it follows 3, the universe has a cause. Now, this is a philosophical argument. It's a logical argument, which means that as long as the first 2 premises are true, the conclusion has to follow, just like 1 plus 1 has to equal 2. So the question is, are these 2 premises true? Well, premise 1 seems pretty commonsensical, right? I mean, both all of our scientific evidence and our everyday common experience confirms that things don't just pop into existence uncaused out of absolutely nothing. Were that premise to be false, as one of my favorite philosophy professors put it, it would literally be worse than magic, because at least when a magician pulls a rabbit, say, out of a hat, you at least still have the magician, let alone the hat. So premise 1 seems self-evidently true. I think it's non-controversial. Premise 2, however, again, for the vast majority of human history, would have been a very controversial claim that the universe began to exist. However, we've seen that in the last 100 years that we just discussed, there's been a lot of great evidence that's very compelling, to the point where I think it's beyond reasonable to accept that premise. Well, if both of those premises are true, again, then the conclusion follows, therefore, the universe has a cause. This immediately prompts the question of what or who could be the cause for the universe. And you have to keep in mind, when we're talking about universe, we're talking about all of space, all of time, all of matter, energy, so that anything that could cause such a thing would have to be outside of space, time, matter, and energy, as well as extraordinarily powerful. And at least for me, when I reflect upon that, I can't think of a better fit than God.
Okay, so we've seen that science verifies one of the most central claims of the Christian faith, that the universe began to exist. Okay, so we're going to jump now into what scientists have called the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. From galaxies and stars down to atoms and subatomic particles, it turns out that the very structure of our universe really comes down to these constants and quantities, and that if any of these were off by even the tiniest little bit, complex life, like you and I, would not be able to be here. And they're so small that the probabilities of them being off even slightly, no life of any kind would be able to exist. There'd be no stars, no planet, no life, not even chemistry. There would be nothing. So he's going to go over just one of them to kind of give you an idea of what that means.
Yeah, just one example here. The gravitational force you see on the top left, there's a gravitational constant. What we're talking about with these constants, if you remember in physics, where you have equations that have these letters and then those represent certain constants that have a constant value. The gravitational constant would be one represented by the capital letter G. This constant has a very specific value, and it turns out if it were off, as she said, in either direction by the smallest amount, either it would be too strong, so when the universe was initially expanding, it would have just collapsed upon itself, or if it were too weak, the gravitational pull would have been so weak that the universe would have expanded too rapidly so that stars would never have formed, or planets wouldn't have formed, matter perhaps would have never have formed. And that's just one constant. And to give you kind of an image in your head of what these improbabilities would look like, the probability that the gravitational constant, as an example, would have the value it has would be as improbable as me shooting a bullet across the entire known universe and hitting a 1-inch target. And that's just for the gravitational constant. All of these others are equally, if not more, fine-tuned than this gravitational constant. However, not only do each of these have to, and this is just a subset, there's dozens of these, not only do each of these have to be fine-tuned, but the ratios between them also have to be fine-tuned. It's probably the most remarkable scientific discovery in our lifetime, or in the last century.
And so Stephen Hawking, you might have heard of him, he says that the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted. You can kind of think of like a dial as you're turning something. They're so finely adjusted to make possible the development of life, which, by the way, that is a young Bryan Smith, circa...
Beardless, yeah.
Beardless, 2007, I think. He actually came to A&M and spoke, and he happened to see him in one of his engineering buildings. So we were like, take a picture of Stephen Hawking. So we did that. That's how nerdy we are. That's right. That's our woo. Okay. Okay. So all this to say, we have to say, okay, but what's the best explanation of this? Why are these constants finely tuned to these exact numbers? So there's really only three options. Either they have to be that way, that would be necessity, or we got really lucky just by chance that they're here, or that they were designed that way. And so the first option, any Office fans in here? Anybody like The Office? Okay, good. So then you'll get my memes then. If you don't like The Office, I'm sorry for you, and you won't get my memes. That's fine. Okay, so the first option, that it has to be that way, would say that the constants couldn't be different, that they have to be the ones that they are. But is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Well, not really. In fact, it's a whole lot more likely that we would have a life-prohibiting universe than we would have one that permits life. The constants and quantities are not determined by laws of nature, and so there's no scientific evidence to think that they have to be that way. So the necessity argument's kind of out. The second one, there's chance. Did we just get really lucky that they just happen to be the perfect numbers and there's 24 or 50 of them and they're all exactly the way they're supposed to be? Some scientists have even come up with ways to try to give this one a little bit more weight. They've come up with the idea of the multiverse. Anybody ever heard of a multiverse theory or heard that term kind of thrown around? The multiverse is kind of the idea that there's this universe generator and it just pops out universes over and over and over. And then eventually, there's one that promotes life. The problem with that whole theory is, one, the universe generator would also have to be finely tuned in order for it to be able to function. And it also just kind of kicks the can down the road, because if it's going to be finely tuned, who finely tuned it, right? Who created that generator? And so the chance argument, this whole it's going to happen, is also just kind of off the table. Okay, so then the third option is that it was designed that way. And so given the implausibility of it being chance or necessity, this seems to be the best explanation. And even atheists and agnostic philosophers and scientists have come to see, as Fred Hoyle puts it, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature.
So really when we come down to it, design seems to be the best explanation for the evidence of the fine-tuning of the universe. And this evidence, again, confirms a specific claim that the Christian faith makes, which is not only that the universe began to exist, but that it is in fact designed. As the psalmist writes, or once wrote, the heavens declare the glory of God. You probably all heard this verse. The skies proclaim the work of his hands, etc. So that's a specifically Christian claim that's being confirmed by the fine-tuning evidence. However, as we saw at the beginning of the universe, this evidence also gives us powerful reasons to believe in the existence of God. So this is often called the fine-tuning argument, and it can be summarized as follows. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance, from which it logically follows it is due to design. And so then again, we're prompted with the question, who or what could be responsible for designing the universe? And already we've discussed it would have to be outside the universe. It also had to be very powerful, but also incredibly intelligent. And I think you know what direction we're going with that one as well.
Okay, got to be something, right? Last one, I'm going to do this one really quickly. I know we're running out of time. The last scientific kind of evidence that we want to share with you today comes from the world of biology, which personally is my favorite. Just as cosmologists have kind of discovered that the universe itself seems to be designed, biologists also have reached similar conclusions. So if you remember Richard Dawkins that I told you at the very beginning, one of those loud scientists who you hear about a lot, even he says this: biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So why does he ignore that apparently designed for a purpose? Why does he ignore that? So he says, according to him, that undirected processes like natural selection and random mutations can produce the appearance of design in living systems. And in his view, natural selection can mimic the powers of the designing intelligence without being guided or directed in any way. However, there are many scientists who argue that there are certain biological features which can be explained by a designing intelligence. And though we could give you lots of examples, the one that you probably most heard of that's the most compelling really comes from the DNA molecule. In 1953, scientists James Watson and Francis Crick mapped out the structure of the DNA molecule. That's where we get that double helix look from. And they found inside of it this 4-character code. These are different nucleotides that when they put together in certain ways, they produce certain proteins. And those proteins are what the cell uses in order to function. And he realized that this looks a whole lot like a computer code. And so just like a computer depends on a certain sequence of zeros and ones in order to function, so too does a DNA molecule depend on a certain sequence. And so even Dawkins has admitted that the code looks like a computer program. So then the big question becomes, where did it come from, right? Where did this digital code or information come? And this really is at the heart of one of science's most complicated and greatest mysteries, and that is just the basis origin of life. So if you're in biology, then you are learning and learned about a cell. Please tell me you've learned about a cell. Oh, good, okay. I love the cell. And we make a cell model with Jell-O. Yeah? Oh, it's so fun. Okay, anyway, or a cake, whatever. So in a cell, the nucleus of the cell is where the DNA is found, coiled up in little chromosomes. And so you might remember that the cell requires those proteins in order to function, which requires it to be able to build on other cells to create bigger things. So here's why this matters. As of today, there is no theory out there, no plausible theory out there that can explain where the content, where that digital information comes from. In other words, there's no way to explain how do we go from inanimate matter into a living cell, even just the very first living cell. Bill Gates put it this way: DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any other software ever created. So similar to the fine-tune of the universe we talked about, how the probabilities are really low, DNA functions like a software program, and so we know that it comes from something because software programs come from programmers. We know that. We always know that intelligent information comes from something that designs it. There has to be something behind the code itself. So many biologists have concluded that this whole given enough time really doesn't work. And so just how we saw that chance doesn't reasonably explain the fine-tuning of the universe, it can't explain the origin of life either.
So this discovery of information at the foundation of even the simplest living cells gives us yet again another good argument that we can look at here on the screen. So this is an argument we can call the origin of life argument, and it would be summarized as follows. Premise one, complex processes containing digital information are best explained by design. That's what we just talked about with programs coming from programmers, etc. Premise two, the origin of life is a complex process containing digital information. That's the surprising scientific evidence. From which it follows, therefore, three, the origin of life is best explained by design, and I'll spare you everything after that. So now, all of this that we've talked about, all of the evidence, all of the arguments, this is not meant to show that science proves that God exists, or that science proves even that Christianity is true. God, by definition, is not within the scope of the scientific method. So what we're trying to show you guys, rather, is that science can verify certain claims that the Christian faith makes, claims that are within the scope of science, and that those claims can have significant theological implications, such as the existence of God.
And so we can say that science doesn't prove faith, but instead it verifies faith. All right, and what we really did scratch the surface, so we kind of rushed toward the end there to try to get you to the end, but we kind of talked about two ideas. Faith underlies science, so we went over the history of science, we went over some assumptions that science makes in order that cannot be proved by science itself, and then we also talked about how science verifies faith. We talked about the cosmological argument, and the fine-tuning argument, and the origin of life argument. These are real scientific discoveries that truly do support and undergird what we understand in our faith tradition. Okay, so we're hoping that all of this content can give you is that science and faith truly are not foes, they are not enemies, but in fact are very, very good friends. And this is one of my favorite quotes. Science without religion is lame, not like lame, like it doesn't work. Religion without science is blind. That's Albert Einstein again. Thank you guys so much for having us today.
So I think we've got, 10 minutes for questions left?
Yeah, so Izzy has to bring the mic. So if you have a question, you have to read it into the mic. And I also want to reiterate, not a physicist, not a cosmologist, but we do know a few things. So if you have questions, we're happy to help give you some stuff.
Okay. They're opening the floor to questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Hi. So probably the most common thing that these kids are going to learn in school that are going to make them question the relationship between science and faith is evolution, the age of the universe, and the age of the world. Where do you guys stand on that?
Okay, so when it comes to evolution,
Repeat the question,
Well, he said it in the mic.
I know, but just to hear, thinking.
He was asking about, like, one of the questions that you guys might face a lot is evolution or understanding age of the earth, all that kind of stuff. Those things are valuable. Those are conversations that are certainly happening all over the place. And you hear about a lot of that stuff very loudly because it's also probably the easiest area for people to combat at. Everything we talked about today is prior to that. So evolutionary theory, for example, you have to have complex life in order to talk about evolution in the first place. And so that's kind of the background. The other reason we didn't really go into a lot of that today, there is really good evidence. There is really good scientists, Christian science, people who are love faith and are scientists on all ends of the spectrum in the evolutionary conversation. There's good reasons all over the place. And so it's not necessarily a theory that you have to dismiss as a Christian. But we truly, one thing we say a lot is we always want to follow the evidence where it leads. And we want to make sure that we are, how am I going to say it? We want to start at the ground first and work our way up, if that makes sense. You have anything to add?
No, I would just repeat. Yeah, it is controversial. There's a lot of different schools of thought on it. It's not fundamental to the Christian worldview either way. I mean, it wouldn't impact anything that we've talked about. And as she said, really ultimately it's the type of thing that it would, if anything, point even more in favor of a creator,
Right.
because you have to have the origin of life, you have to have matter, you have to have stars, you have to have all that in the first place.
Yeah, and it would also require a lot longer than a 30-minute conversation.
Yeah.
When I have taught on different theories on the age of the earth and with the Bible and all those things, and that really does require a whole lot more. We do have resources that if you are interested in that and you'd like to kind of see what are some options, how are there ways to kind of mesh this with my faith, those I'm happy to help provide those as well. I can't see.
Okay, hopefully I word this right. But can you relate like how dinosaurs in like the prehistoric era relates to like Adam and Eve and the Garden of Everything?
Do you want me to?
So we're talking about dinosaurs.
Well, I'm not a paleontologist.
Here's how I'd put it. So this kind of similar to like kind of what he was talking about with the question has to do with how do you square age of Earth, all that stuff. Science and faith is such a big topic. Like it's a really hard topic even to pare down in 30 minutes. That would be like understanding paleontology and understanding archaeology even a little bit with that, and understanding how old the Earth is. Now, like I said, there are good Christians on all different spectra. And so it's one of those conversations where it would require going through all of the different viewpoints. And then truly, I think this is the beautiful part about science, is you get to come to your own conclusion. A lot of times when you hear things at school, or as you're gonna go to college, you're gonna get a whole lot of stuff thrown at you. It's important to kind of take a step back and kind of what we talked about at the very beginning. Is what this person telling me, is this science? Or is this a philosophical understanding? Because a lot of the times in those kinds of conversations, especially around age of Earth and dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff, that naturalism starts to really seep in, understanding that, or that scientism, that, I have to use science in order to be able to think at all. And they oftentimes will distract by throwing what they call red herrings. These are ideas that it's not actually the actual conversation that we're having. And so I think sometimes taking a step back and looking, what are they actually talking about? Is this really science or not? Now, specifics when it gets to dinosaurs and all that stuff, again, that would go with like age of Earth, different viewpoints that people look at. But I also think this needs to be reiterated. The Bible is not a science textbook. The Bible is not meant to be opened up and said that I am going to learn absolutely everything I can learn from the Bible. That's not what it's for, right? The Bible is written for us. It's written in a cultural context that we need to take into account, and to an ancient group of people. And so when we read scripture, we have to be careful not to insert our own 21st century understanding into it. And that comes to it with old age Earth, all that kind of stuff. We have to be careful not to overly interpret what we see. You have anything to add?
Nope.
Okay. Sorry, I went on a spree on that one. Anything else? I know that's a big topic. It's hard. It's a big topic.
Right here, I think I have it.
What are the sites that you can look up to learn more?
Oh, good question. Okay, so this QR code, in fact, thank you for segueing me into my next spot. The QR code that's up here, if you scan that, it will bring you to a link tree that's got a whole bunch of stuff on it. I think I can pull it up. Let me see.
I wouldn't try, just to be safe.
I could be fancy and do this. I'm technologically advanced, sort of. I'll put it back up in a minute. Oh, let's see. Look at me! Hey, haters, you gonna hate? Okay, this is a group of websites that I have for you. So the first section up here, these are 5-minute videos. They're real short. They really go into kind of the stuff that we talked about today. Kind of that basic, is there really a conflict? And I think the questions you guys are asking are kind of past that. And so if you keep scrolling down, there's even more, all kinds of stuff. There's some video resources. Reasonablefaith.org is by far one of my favorite websites when it comes to the Christian faith in general. It's a little more philosophical in nature than it is scientific sometimes. But like I said, a lot of the times the conversations that are being had are not scientific, they're philosophical. And so that's there. They've got some really, really good animated videos that you can go and watch. Has anyone ever heard of Lee Strobel? Anybody other than adults? Oh, good. Okay. Love y'all, but you know. Lee Strobel, I highly recommend that you guys go and watch this Case for Creator documentary. It is when I taught in middle school science, I had the opportunity to teach this actual book, and it is a really good at a high school level understanding of the Christian faith and how it squares with science. It's a knockoff YouTube video, but I would go and watch that. That's got a lot of really good information in it. And then the websites that we have up here, if you're interested in, again, how some of these like science and faith conversations come together, Reasonable Faith has got a lot of stuff. BioLogos and the Discovery Institute are both really good. I should preface it with, which is true of any institution, it's going to have its own bent toward things, if that makes sense. They have their own ways of seeing the world. And so you want to make sure that you just are kind of keeping that in check. And then there is 2 really good books. I love to read. It's really good. I highly recommend it. If you're not reading, you should read. On Guard, there's an On Guard, which is from the guy who started Reasonable Faith. There's an On Guard for students that is a little more apologetic in nature, but it does have some good scientific stuff, including that cosmological argument that we talked about. And then the Case for Creator, there's a student edition of that. There's a kids edition, a students edition, and an adult edition of that. And it's got really good information in it, so I highly recommend. I'm going to put this back up. See, look, I can do this. Hold on. Where's my mouse? It's up there. I'll put this back up, so if you want the actual QR code to get to those, you can do that. Any other questions? We went a little over. Yes, she's back there.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I can't see. These lights are very
Yeah, it's
bright.
hard to see.
I feel bad for the worship team on Sunday.
So you had mentioned that, like, I think it was in the beginning, that science was kind of derived from more Eurocentric perspectives within Christianity, based on Christianity beliefs. But there were like remnants of science dating back to almost 2,000 years before those Eurocentric beliefs in countries like China and like with the Aztecs and things.
Yeah.
So if science was like kind of had been before those like Eurocentric, like religious kind of aspects of it, how do you like tie those two in together if like one was developed before the other?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think to her point when she mentioned, we have these glimmerings of science for sure with like the pyramids of Egypt, or the Chinese invented, I think, the compass and gunpowder and all sorts of other things. So you definitely have elements of that going on, but what she was talking about was specifically the very systematic, modern approach to science that we think of as like the scientific method today. So I want to fully agree with you that there's definitely been people exploring the world since time began, really, and really working in a scientific way in a loose sense, but in the very refined, narrow sense that science is defined and used today. That's kind of what we meant by that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think too, if this is all true, right? If this is all truth is God's truth. And if this is all true, then it would make sense that they were already doing science before they called it science, right? It's always been here. God's always instilled that in the hearts of people to want to get to know him and his creation and what he designed for us. So it makes sense that there's going to be glimmerings of it. Whether it is done correctly is kind of what came from the European civilization. Yeah. Anything
I think
else?
we're almost out of time, right?
Yeah.
Do you have any more?
Maddie.
No?
Oh,
Just waving?
she's just saying hi. Hi, Maddie. Anybody else? Well, we're here. If you have any additional questions, I shouldn't do that while I'm talking. We're happy to answer anything else. Or if you have things that you didn't want to ask because it's a microphone and those are kind of scary, we're happy to answer them, and we can help point you to any kind of resource that we have available for you. Thanks for coming, guys.
Yeah. Thank y'all.